Hello, this is David Lee, and welcome to today's Prevent Connect Power and Prevention Ending Child Sexual Abuse web conference series called Youth Serving Organizations' Role in Ending Child Sexual Abuse. Prevent Connect is a national project of the California Coalition Against Sexual Assault, sponsored by the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. The views and information provided in this web conference do not necessarily represent the official views of the United States government, the CDC, or CalCASA. I'm really pleased to be able to have you at our Power and Prevention Ending Child Sexual Abuse series, and I want to introduce our hosts for this series. From the beginning, we've had Cordelia Anderson and Joan Tabachnik here. So welcome, Joan and Cordelia, and it's a pleasure to have you here, and I'm going to hand the podium over to you, Cordelia.
Hey, thank you so much. We're delighted to be here. And I thought under my name, Cordelia, you can figure out which one is my 10-month-old golden doodle named Rose and which one is me. And I'll say a few words about who I am, since so many of you are new, and then pass it over to Joan to do the same. It's been my privilege with Joan and with CalCASA to be able to co-host this whole series over the years, and I have been doing work to address and prevent child sexual abuse for over 40 years, so a long time, and I've had the pleasure of connecting with both David and Joan over many of those decades. So, Joan.
And it's a pleasure doing this series with you, Cordelia and David, and just excited that we have this focus on child sexual abuse prevention. I have been working sort of in the field for about, I guess, a little over 25 years, and currently I'm actually on a fellowship with the Department of Justice looking at sexual violence prevention, mostly on college campus communities. So very excited to be here, and also excited to have a chance to be able to work with both Les and Marcus in pulling this together. So back to you, Cordelia.
Well, great. Our next series coming up, did I just go backwards instead of forwards? I just wanted to mention that in the past we have done other things related to youth-serving organizations and looking at the role with youth-serving organizations. So this is, I wanted to mention two of those, and that is the after Sandusky, Lessons Learned, where we had Janet Saul from CDC and Karen Baker and from National Sexual Violence Resource Center, and Keith Kaufman from Portland State University addressing that. Joan, you want to just mention a little bit about the other one?
Sure. So the other one we did was 2013, a year later, which was taking some of what the lessons learned actually from Sandusky and saying, how do we put that into practice? So we had Jetta Bernier, who from Math Citizens for Children, who developed a program called Gatekeepers for Kids, specifically looking at what can be done with small organizations, and also Malia Arrington from the U.S. Olympic Committee. And that certainly has come up a lot more over the years since 2013 about basically youth in sports. So those are just two other, I think, really wonderful webinars that we did on this particular topic. But I think what we're going to say, like, what have we learned since 2012 and 2013? That's what we're hoping to cover today.
Yeah, Joe, excuse me for 1 second. I just want to come in and just remind people that we, in addition to that, we have over, and Meghna just posted a link, we have over 20 web conferences, because we have, since 2/3 of our audience is new to us, I want to just highlight that we have a whole host of topics, not just about youth-serving organizations, but a full range of topics on looking at preventing child sexual abuse, and invite you to be able to look at the slides, look at the recordings, and be able to see the resources that are available to them. And we do have a whole host. We just highlighted a few of the examples on this slide. Otherwise it would be too many to read.
And it's one of the benefits, just to amplify that, it's just one of the benefits of what we've been able to collect over these years with great speakers like we have today. But the reason we're coming back to youth-serving organizations, and really wanted to highlight that this is not the first time we've dealt with it, but the fact there's so many new people on this shows how important it is. Just to really, our learning objectives to discuss the role of youth-serving organizations in ending child sexual abuse, to really increase our understanding of risk within organizations. And really, what's important is articulating key elements of effective implementation and helping you to identify at least 2 new resources along with that.
Great. So basically, I think, if you're on this call, we know that you're interested in this, but we thought it might be helpful just to talk about why we need to talk about child sexual abuse prevention policies within youth-serving organizations. And I won't go through all those details, but I think that the fact that if you look at this from an organizational point of view, I think that there was a great article in actually Forbes magazine, of all places, a couple of years ago that really talked about how organizations are actually pushed towards not recognizing what I would say like the fatal flaws within otherwise strong performers. So, for example, that if somebody is whether you're talking about someone who is a good salesperson or somebody is a great counselor or teacher, we may not want to see some of the other things that are going on with them. And then the second mistake that organizations make is that also that when you do see something wrong, we don't necessarily address them immediately. We sort of hope they'll go away or hope they'll change. And by doing that, you're sending a very wrong message to the entire organization by not dealing with that problem and that personnel immediately. And then the third thing is because we tend to look much more at the short term, we tend to look more towards cover-up. And rather than looking at what can be successful for years, we think about what do we need to do for right now. And I think a great example of an organization that sort of saw something that was a problem and addressed it immediately was like Johnson & Johnson. They had a problem with Bayer Aspirin many years ago. They immediately took it off the market. And by doing so, they really emphasized their values as an organization. So what we're trying to do is sort of say that organizations need to begin to shift from avoiding the short-term pain to create this looking at much of the longer-term vision of what their organization is. So I wanted to just go to the next slide and ask people, and before I go to this slide, I just want to ask people maybe just to put in the chat room, the chat side, just like since so many people are from youth-serving organizations or maybe have worked with youth-serving organizations, can you just maybe put in the chat what kind of organization have you worked with? So as you're chatting, as you're putting that in the chat, I just want to also talk about that we're using this concept of the social ecological model, looking at what can be done at the individual level or the intrapersonal, the relationship level, interpersonal, community level, and the policy level, but we're focusing on that middle group, the institutional level. And we're going to see what can be done at the institutional level. And what's great about sort of looking at so many organizations are being represented here. We have a lot of people, it looks like, from Boys and Girls Clubs, which makes sense, Les, given your background. We also just have a lot of people from dual agencies, which have had that broader look. So Children's Advocacy Centers. So we're seeing like a lot of different organizations being represented here. And I think particularly it's great to see that also like tribal organizations. We hopefully address some of those issues as well as we go through about some of the cultural concepts that we need to think about. So Cordelia, back to you.
One of our favorite quotes is this one that probably a lot of you use in your prevention from the Institute of Medicine Health Promotion Study back in 2006, and that is, it is unreasonable to expect that people will change their behavior easily when there's so many forces in the social, cultural, and physical environment that conspire against such change. We know that, especially for those of us that do direct service, it's easy to get focused on what we can do to help an individual, but we want to also understand why there are so many individuals that need that assistance and what we can do in terms of systemic change, and what are the values and strategic interventions that are needed to create a culture in which this kind of harm is unlikely to happen. So it's one of the pieces that we entered this with. We know that it's a balancing act. We know that the benefit of youth-serving organizations is huge to the healthy development that is so key to prevention. We want to promote healthy development. We want to help have more caring relationships, as many of those as are possible in young people's lives. So we want them to have all the benefits of being part of these organizations. And we recognize that by the very nature of some of the missions, it sets up some things that can be potentially make kids vulnerable, like one-on-one connection. And then, so if you're a mentoring organization, what do you do to also assure that you get the kind of care and contact that people need while also assuring safety? Or if you're working with children that have different needs as a result of disabilities, how do we balance the needs for attention with the physical attention and the needs for safety?
So a question we also would love to just hear your thoughts about is what gets in our way? So if we actually as a group sort of agree that it's important for organizations to implement some kinds of safety policies, what gets in our way? If you can put some of those ideas maybe in the chat there. And it's also just that what we want to make, even though we're highlighting that there are things that get in their way, there are barriers, that many organizations are already moving beyond those barriers, that it is possible to move beyond them. And that, in fact, one of the pieces that I guess I like to say when I talk to organizations is that when you do create policies and you are doing everything you can to ensure a safer environment, you're actually giving your organization a competitive edge. So I think that that's an important concept that we have here that we're trying to sort of promote as we go forward. So I think just some of the things that people are saying, that sometimes we have no control over changing policies based on our position or relationship. So that's absolutely really feel for people, and to know that we often sort of emphasize how we can't often do this alone. Sometimes there's a lack of resources, sometimes it's politics, and also that there may not be enough staff, and also just there may be a lack of knowledge around both on sexual abuse within the organization, particularly from the leadership. So maybe not enough leadership either, not enough staff to implement it. So there's some wonderful ideas here. There's also just the high concept of fear and shame. All of those have an impact. So am I controlling the slides now,
Yep,
Cordelia,
you're the next
or are
one,
you?
sorry.
Can you push it to the next slide?
Yep, I'm trying to get there. There we go.
Great, thank you. So here's just something I think it just echoes what everybody has been saying, what gets in our way, which is a lack of knowledge about the scope of the problem. So it can't happen here is sometimes the reaction that you get. There's a lack of understanding of the harm that's done, that boys will be boys. Someone talked about not just embarrassment, but shame as well. Sometimes it's easier to do nothing and hope that it all goes away, the lack of resources. And I think that, again, people are isolated, and so that there might be resources in the community, but not necessarily within their organization. Fear of sort of embarrassment or embarrassing volunteers, employees, and just sort of overwhelmed about where to start. So that just echoes what a lot of other people on the call have already, or in the chat room have mentioned, and many more. So thank you very much for that. So back to you.
I'm trying to get to the next slide, which is also yours, which is
okay, that's right.
I'm not going forward, but maybe some.
Okay. Well, I can.
Go.
So just mention that the next thing. Okay, great. So this is a report that is available for free. That actually was produced way back in 2002, and it was the Centers for Disease Control recognizing that there was a lack of information and around what can organizations do. So this is a report that, even though it's quite dated, and the CDC is considering updating this. It's actually a great resource and a great sort of primer to begin with, and it identifies 6 different areas in order to examine. And it really was because of the fact there was nothing happening in 2002. And that obviously has changed quite a bit since then. In the next slide, then you can sort of see some of the innovative responses that have really happened since the last webinar even. We show there's some significant changes at the institutional level. So I'd like to say, since I'm there's some new funding from the SMART office that's looking at, particularly at campus sexual assault, but looking at the situational factors or the environmental factors can be changed within the educational institution. There's new laws in New Jersey, which is my home state, so I'd like to mention that, which basically says that for any organization which receives state funding and works with kids has to have some child sexual abuse prevention policies in place. There's also a new report from out of Australia that both Keith Kaufman and Marcus worked on, which is summarize what is happening around the world in terms of youth-serving organizations and protection policies. And these are just to name sort of a few that are out there. The Safe to Compete is a wonderful website to take a look at that's been updated basically in 2017 after the U.S. gymnastic case. So these are just some of the resources that are out there, and we'll be talking about some of the ones particularly that have to do with Dame Janet Smith, as well as the Royal Commission that Marcus will be addressing with some of the UK perspective.
And just before I introduce our speakers, because we want to get to them, is that one of the things that has been coming up a lot, and I don't know if either of our speakers will get a chance to do that or we do in discussions, or maybe you can enter what you're doing with that, is how we really deal with historic trauma and the different ways that organizations deal with not only current reports or incidents or investigations and safety, but for incidents that happened a long time ago. What's the most respectful way to end and healing way an honest way, and way with integrity to deal with that historic trauma, and how do we address that. So we are all thrilled to have our speakers today, and my next piece is I want to make sure we get to them and introduce. I'm going to introduce first Marcus Aruga, and I want to just say that I'm going to introduce both speakers now, so you have their backgrounds. They'll each have 15 minutes, and then I have your discussion after both are done, and we will have time for that discussion, which is so important. If you have questions as we go through those, type them in, and it's our job to try to track those so the speakers don't have to do that and loop back to them. So Marcus, we're so delighted to have you where it's now 7:23 in Manchester, UK. You're joining us from across the globe here, and he has a master's in econ and social work as an independent safeguarding consultant and a visiting research fellow at the Center for Applied Social Work, Youth, and Family Research, the University of Huddersfield. And he has spent a lot of his career in various roles relating to child sexual abuse and sexual offending at UK Child Protection Not-for-Profit. He's also the past editor-in-chief and current associate editor of the Journal for Sexual Aggression and the past chair of the National Organization for the Treatment of Sexual Abuser. He has authored over 50 publications. He's authored a number of books. I'll let him talk about this more as he goes through this. He has had a particular issue. I do want to mention he's got a new book coming out after Savile, What Do We Know, What Do We Need to Do? That's going to be published this year. Maybe it's out. And he has a particular interest in safeguarding organizations and has been involved in extensive reviews of the literature of people who do this work, and we'll be hearing more about the report that Joan referenced related to the work he did for the Australian Royal Commission in looking at a literature search review on child sexual abuse in organizations that he did with Dr. Keith Kaufman, who's been on past conferences. Then you will be hearing from Les Nichols, who many of you know, and Les is a consultant to youth-serving organizations and an expert witness to youth protection. He's also past president of the National Coalition to Prevent Child Sexual Abuse and Exploitation. He has spent 22 years as a facility and child safety vice president with Boys and Girls Clubs of America. They have over 4,000 sites and serve over 4 million youth. He has a master's in science in security administration and a certificate in enterprise risk management and certificate in protection professionals. He is also a member of the International Association for Professional Security Consultants, and I love this, since 1982 he's been a licensed architect, and he likes crime novels. So we've got two excellent speakers, and Marcus, I'm going to bring it back to you to take over, and we are so glad you're both here.
Thank you very much, Cordelia. I'm delighted to be here. Just let me get my head around how to move the slides on. Yes. Great. Hello, and thank you very much for inviting me to do this. I'm very much aware that I've got 15 minutes to do my presentation, which is fine, but it does mean that I'm going to go relatively quickly through the issues that I want to raise. So it's a bit of a roller coaster, but I'm very happy to enable anybody who wants it to have access to the research that I'm talking about afterwards. Okay. So I think the place I would start is to say that where we focus our prevention efforts is crucially mediated. Did I move that on? Is crucially mediated by how we understand what we're protecting people from. And in relation to organizational offending, then that started to tilt really because of cases like one that I know you're all going to be very familiar with, Jerry Sandusky. And what we get is this notion of charismatic pedophiles, that what we have to do is to protect our organizations from charismatic pedophiles. And here in the UK, Joan referred to it, we've had a massive case with Jimmy Savile. And if you don't know anything about him, it's very difficult to explain just what a significant figure he was in British cultural life. He was a great cultural figure, just he was there. He was a an icon of everybody of my age, of our childhood right the way through. So when he died in his 80s, people lined the streets of his home city to see his funeral cortege go past. What then transpired after he died was that he was in fact an incredibly, almost unprecedentedly prolific sex offender. So when you got that combination of a man who abused so utterly prolifically and was seen and respected so greatly, that sent huge shockwaves through the UK. And Joan referred to the Dame Janet Smith review, and that was a review into his career at the BBC, so they could try and understand how could this man have behaved in that way. The problem, in a sense, with all of that is that whilst these people, these very charismatic pedophiles, can indeed be extremely dangerous, as Savile was, what it tends to do is to lead us towards taking what I call a stockade approach, that we rely on vetting and screening, taking up criminal records checks, references, interviews, all really, really important things, but use those with the notion that if we can keep the bad people out of our organization, then the people that we let in will be safe to employ. So that's the notion of the stockade, that we keep the bad guys out and we let the good people in. And one study that sort of reinforced that notion was this one by Kelly Price, Carl Hansen, who some of you may know, and their colleague, whose first name I don't know, I'm afraid. And they found that 17 out of 20 voluntary organizations, you can read the slide, didn't have anything specific to the potential for abuse, but considered their vetting processes would detect potential abusers because they thought their measures were so exhaustive. Now, I've spent my career working with sexual offenders. I don't know of any exhaustive measures that would achieve that. And I'm pretty sure that what they're relying on is the things that I mentioned. So the problem with that is that that's where we're putting our prevention efforts. And I just really like this sign that I found on the web. It's that notion that things may not be what they appear. And I would suggest that we need to think beyond these charismatic paedophiles. So what I'm going to tell you about is, initially, is the findings from some research that I did with my colleagues, Debbie Allnock and Paula Telford, where we interviewed people who volunteered to talk to us, and they had been convicted of sexual offences against children in the context of organisations. They were either volunteers or they were employees. And just to give you a sense of who we spoke to, these were the 19 people that formed our sample. So we got a decent cross-representation. Now, there was an awful lot came out of that, but the one thing that I'm going to focus on was this whole notion about were they all preferential sex offenders? Because we tend to assume that people who sexually abuse children, I mean, it almost sounds like it's absolutely logical. People who sexually abuse children want to do that, they set out to do it, they join organisations with the intention of doing that, and then that's what they work to do. And people like, certainly Savile, I've read the Sandusky report, but I wouldn't want to have an opinion about whether that was his primary motivation. But Savile, very much a very committed, very predatorial, preferential sex offender against children and adults. What we started to think about, though, was this notion that actually maybe there was more than one category of sex offender, and that the one I want to focus on is this one at the end, situational sex offenders. And we define those as offenders, people whose propensity to abuse, the possibility that they might abuse, was either previously unknown to them and to other people, or that it was unacknowledged by them. So they were repressing that notion that they might possibly have a sexual attraction to children. So the problem then becomes, if one is screening or vetting, that you can interview them and you will not get any sense of that possible risk, not because they're hiding it, but actually because it's suppressed so deep or even doesn't exist at that point that you can't find it. And that what we identified was that their offending seemed to be specific to a set of situational factors, and I've used the word potentiates. It's not a terribly user-friendly word, but potentiates their offending. It's not that it causes their offending, but when those things come together, then the possibility that they might abuse becomes greater. So to try and express that in a more diagrammatic way, it's this notion that when there were, and in all of them, we were able to identify a range of specific personal issues, things that were going on in their lives at that time, that when that combined with an organizational context which characteristically was defined by not having clear expectations for everybody about behavior and what was expected, about loose boundaries, about very often a lack of appropriate supervision of what was happening for staff, that what you had was that the personal issues and the organizational context meant that essentially they were, in one sense, floating free within the organization. They weren't being held by an organizational structure and culture. And that what tended to happen, if you look at the bottom circle, that wasn't any child or young person, that they would form a close emotional relationship with a particular child or young person. And very often that was partly about meeting their own unmet emotional needs, but would then go on to sexualize that relationship, which is, of course, abusive. So, and that was quite a challenging thing. We spent a lot of time struggling with, is this really what we think we're seeing? But that was the model we came up with. And after that, I went away and tried to think about what was the way in which people could, I understood if these were the ingredients, but what was the process by which that possibly happened? And what I came to is, and this is a theoretical model, it's not literally how people will behave. What I came to was this notion that I'm sure you may be familiar with the notion of the slippery slope, that if people do one thing, it inevitably leads to another. This is slightly different in that I think there is potentially a slippery slope, but the progression is not inevitable. But the way I've done the diagram, the idea is that the further down the slope somebody goes, then the steeper the sides get, and it's slippery. So it's harder to get back out the further down you progress. So if you look across the screen from the left to the right, things start off with normal activity, and then you get these contributory factors which potentially kick in with that individual. Any abuse going down to the next level involves violating boundaries. And for these folks then, there start to be boundary violations, possibly in terms of their relationship with that child or young person, having contact outside of if it's in school, for example, having contact outside of school, if that's something which is not supposed to be happening, or giving their phone number or whatever it might be. But boundaries start to get violated. And during that process, it's a very human thing that we all do. They are likely to be either justifying their behavior or normalizing their behavior, or in some way convincing themselves and possibly convincing other people that what they're doing is okay. The problem is that if that then proceeds to the next level, it can start potentially unconsciously, both for that individual and for the child or young person, to become a grooming process. So it may not be that they're consciously thinking, I'm going to groom this kid and then I can sexually abuse them, but that relationship becomes more intimate, and as that happens, then potentially they become more enmeshed in the process, and so does the child or young person. And that can then, if it goes all the way to abuse, proceed to abuse, and of course then there's negative outcomes for both them and for their victim. So the logical thing, if one takes that model, is that if, when boundary violations are identified, there is an appropriate, proportionate organizational intervention, then it prevents that process from continuing. That we actually stop the process before it's become anything possibly that relates to child abuse. It's just about saying, we have agreed ways of doing things in this organization, and this doesn't match that, so let's deal with it. What that leads to then is that one can either just be doing that individually, or hopefully that's supported by a positive organizational culture. And there's lots of very fancy definitions of organizational culture, but the one I was really taken with was this very simple one from a UK government agency. And it's this notion that culture is the way we do things around here, that the way things actually happen is what creates the culture. And that culture has a huge impact because it means people judge their own behavior against what the norm is in this organization. If everybody comes into work late, then people come into work late. And that the organizational culture has a huge influence. How a positive organizational culture gets formed, I would suggest, has a number of ingredients. And if you organize that into 3 areas, then it starts off by recruiting and encouraging and supporting the adults in the organization to be what I've termed here as safe adults, so that they have a sense of professionalism, they are aware both of themselves and of their responsibilities, they have a clear sense of boundaries which is reinforced by the organization, and they are child-focused, and child-focused in their actions as well as in their intent. That if you go to the left-hand side of the slide, that the organization has a range of things which support an appropriate organizational culture. So policies, a clear code of conduct, appropriate training, that there is a good system of governance, and we have a system here where serious cases of child abuse get reviewed comprehensively, and a number of them come up with the absence of good governance as a contributory factor to organizations which don't safeguard adequately. That there's a clear managerial commitment, and that safe recruitment, that stuff that I was saying isn't sufficient, is done. And I'm not suggesting for a moment they shouldn't be done, but that we shouldn't stop there. And that on the right-hand side at the bottom there, that there is proper acknowledgement of professional standards and appropriate national guidance. So I'm just finishing up. We had a case over here which nothing like the scale of Savile, but it certainly sent shockwaves. It was all over the newspapers. At a very prestigious school in London, it was actually an American teacher who was very popular in the school, who it transpired had been taking kids on school trips, and everybody knew about that. But what he'd actually been doing was drugging the boys, putting sleeping tablets into Oreo cookies, and then sexually abusing them while they were unconscious. It was a dreadful case, and he's believed to have abused 50 or 60 young men. And there was a review that followed that as they looked at how could such an otherwise high-achieving organization have such a dreadful incident happen. And one of the things they focused on was a child-safe organizational culture. They suggested some key elements, which I was really taken with because I hadn't seen it expressed in this clear way before. So the first bullet point, that there's an explicit safeguarding culture and an ethos, and that the values and behaviors and the bits I've highlighted in blue, I just thought this is what you don't see. That they not only are they written down, not only is it what people say that they do, but they're actually clearly articulated, that when you join the organization, you're very clear about how it is that organization expects things to happen, and that they're lived at every level in the organization. Having them written down and then people's behavior negates that is a surefire way for everyone to know that they don't really mean much. One of the things we found in the research when we were interviewing the offenders related to this second point, that some of the things people were saying was that there weren't clear policies and procedures, that things weren't made clear to them about what was expected, and very much this notion that staff need to know if they do have concerns, how can they be raised. I was, as Cordelia said in the introduction, a manager in a not-for-profit organisation in the UK for many years, so the notion of courageous management really resonated with me, because if people raise concerns, frankly, as a manager, the last thing I wanted to do was to have to deal with them. I did it because that was the job and it was the right thing to do, but it's really hard to do, and it's hard to do it right. And I thought this notion that actually managers need to be prepared to be courageous about dealing with things, and that will encourage staff to be able to challenge and to raise concerns. And crucially, that children and young people have a way to raise their concerns and know that those things will be taken seriously. So my final slide is really a way of trying to summarize all of that, is that a safer organization isn't just one element. It's not just the safeguarding. It's not just the screening. It's all of those things that need to be in place that ultimately I would suggest will contribute towards an organization being as close to being a child-safe organization as it possibly can be. Okay, so that's me.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much. And if you could advance it one more slide, Marcus, I'd appreciate that.
No, I've lost it.
It just, yeah.
I no longer have the power.
But you did it just in time. So we'd like to ask everyone, just like, what do you think is the, it's interesting because I think, also you talked about the importance of comprehensive, and I think, what do you consider one of the most important factors in creating a safeguarding organization? If you could maybe type in on the side, and certainly, one of the things that strikes me as I listen to you is, the importance of being comprehensive, but also maybe for me at least when I think about that question is that I think about a lot of the people who work with kids with sexual behavior problems and the importance of being consistent, and so that that if there is an importance of not just of articulating what the boundaries are, but also making sure that all those things are consistently enforced throughout all levels of the organization. So if I were to answer sort of one single most important factor, I would sort of say consistency would be the one piece I would add to at least what you've said. Some of the other things that people are mentioning here is communications and communicating expectation, which is a wonderful suggestion there. I think also the ongoing visibility of the issues, and not just to talk about it once, but make sure that it's articulated and lived at all levels of the organization. And I think that the organizational leadership sees it as really a critical part of what they're doing, and that there's some integrity behind that. The supervision of staff, so it's really people seeing it at all levels again. I think that's a really important point. And again, seeing all levels, seeing that keep coming up again and again. And then policies should be very clear and understandable, so that not only are they, but I think that think about making sure that policies are doable and not just something which is just articulated, because it may also open up a further liability for the organization if they're not being implemented, if they have the policies but don't implement them. So I don't know if, Marcus, do you have any other thoughts about that before we turn this over to Les? There's some great ideas coming through on the chat. I don't know if you can read those from your end.
I can, and I was thinking that pretty much sort of covers my range. And as you were talking, I was just trying to distill, and I think for me it would be that the organizational understandings of what it is that we expect is evolved by everybody. I mean, it's a big ask, but if it's written in head office and sent down the line and people look at it and think, yeah, I agree with that, that's okay. But actually it's about everybody being able to have a voice to say, this is what I think this should look like in our organization, and really get to the point where they own it. So when it's not happening, people feel personally about it and then feel enabled to speak up and say, actually, this isn't the way that we said we wanted to do things, we collectively. So let's think about how we don't do that. Yeah. So it would be that. It would be that creating a sense of collective ownership of the organization.
That's wonderful. Thank you. And I think now we'll just turn this over to Les now, and hear from a U.S. perspective here. So welcome, Les.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, perfectly, yeah.
Okay, good. And you know what? I don't see my controls on my screen. Oh, I do. No, I'm looking for...
You're looking for the arrow next to the box that says presenter.
I see it. Thank you. Okay. All right. Thank you, David. And before I get started, I want to also thank Cordelia and Joan and David and Meghna for inviting me to present. And I also want to thank Marcus. It was a great presentation, and much of what he said and what Joan and Cordelia said lay the groundwork for what I'm going to talk about today. It was interesting. Marcus was talking about the issues of culture within the organization, which is a big part of what I want to explore today. And I'm not looking at it from the standpoint of research so much as I am looking at it from the standpoint of a large organization with a very established culture that is spread across the entire United States, even overseas. And in fact, I noticed as I was taking notes on the people that had signed up and their comments on the right of the screen, how many Boys and Girls Clubs had signed up. Everyone from Hicksville, New York, Goshen, Indiana, my cousin Samantha Nichols in northern Chautauqua. We have Central Sonoma, California, which is one of really our highest performers in the area of child protection within the Boys and Girls Club organization. Metro Denver, Colorado, Snohomish County, Washington, a great organization. Glasgow, Barron County, Kentucky is really very progressive and working hard in the area of child protection. Corvallis, Oregon, Alaska, perhaps some others that I didn't catch. But it's an indication of how wide this organization spreads and how many kinds of communities, not only large metropolitan, but many smaller cities that it reaches. And I might also add my colleague and dear friend, Dana Pink, who's a director of organizational development out of our Midwest office in Chicago, and she's based in Michigan. And a tremendous professional, someone who's really helped me in developing ideas over the years. So looking at this from the inside, from the organization, I thought the best way to start was with a little story, a prologue, and that is an Aesop's Fable about the north wind and the sun. And Aesop told a story about the north wind and the sun, and that is that the north wind was the loudest and the proudest of all of the natural elements, and proud of its power, and believed that it was the most powerful of all the elements. It had the greatest power to destroy with its strong winds, with its ice and snow and sleet, and to bring life to an absolute halt. It was convinced it was the greatest of all. And the sun tired of hearing the north wind brag about its greatness. And so the sun challenged the north wind to a duel, to a competition, to see who, in fact, was the greatest of the elements. And so the north wind agreed. And the sun pointed out a little shepherd out in the field tending his flock and said, why don't we see who can get the shepherd to remove his cloak, or to remove that shepherd's cloak. But we can't create any harm. We can't destroy the shepherd. Well, the north wind immediately agreed and began blowing hard and hard and harder and cold and colder, almost until icicles were coming off of the shepherd's nose. The harder the north wind blew, the harder the shepherd fought against it, clung to his meager cloak, and resisted with everything he had until finally the north wind had to concede to stop. Otherwise, he would lose the entire competition. And he turned it over to the sun. The sun began very subtly, just a slight warming of the air and all of the area around and the ground, and the shepherd himself, not in any hurry, getting the shepherd to slowly warm up from the north wind. Eventually turning up the heat a little bit, getting the shepherd to relax, to take off his cloak. He can begin perspiring, sit down, seek the shade of a tree, and actually give thanks to the sun for such a wonderful day. So for us, for Aesop rather, the lesson was that persuasion is greater than force. But for us, the lesson is that engagement enables enforcement. And that's an important concept to take with us as we look at within the organization, how do we truly make change happen? I want to go back to something that Joan was talking about. My dates don't jive with yours, so maybe the answer is somewhere in between. But my dates had shown 2007. Maybe it was earlier, Joan. But the Centers for Disease Control had a great project that was really a landmark project. Cordelia and Joan, Keith Kaufman, who was mentioned also, great colleague, were all involved, David Finkelhor. Many of the major thinkers in the area of abuse serving, or rather in the area of child sexual abuse prevention, were involved in this project, as well as about 8 or so people from national youth serving organizations, including myself. And we were involved for several days working with the CDC, and it took about 18 months for them to take our information and make it into a published report. But this was absolutely foundational. This was a real game changer for youth serving organizations because it finally defined what organizations should be doing. And there were 6 areas listed here that they identified best practices framed around the issue of creating policies and procedures that would make those happen. Screening, interactions between individuals, how supervision and monitoring is to take place, the nature of physical environments, what's an appropriate and timely response to the recognition or even the suspicion of abuse that's connected with the organization or with its clients or the children that it serves. And of course, training, education, awareness, all of those things that involve the communication and the changing of people's opinions. All of those were so important and were so well distilled in this document. And immediately, among the things that organizations did was to translate those into practical concerns, as would be the nature of an organization. And so screening was distilled into criminal background checks. Interactions was distilled into a formal code of conduct. Supervision was often distilled into rules, such as one-on-one that Joan had mentioned, and staff-to-youth ratios for those organizations like Boys and Girls Clubs that serve groups of youth. Physical environment might be distilled and boiled down to inspection checklists. And response was usually capsulized into fulfilling mandated reporter laws. Training was oftentimes carried out as some kind of universal orientation that everybody had to go through. But one of the things that organizations found is that policies can demand certain things of people, but they can't create things. They can't create certain actions that are the voluntary actions of the people, the stakeholders in the organizations. They can't create vigorous oversight. Things that some of these things Marcus talked about. They can't create a problem-seeking attitude that's always saying what could go wrong. They don't create a protector mindset, and which involves also people willing to take chances in order to help with a problem. They can't create the desire to encourage others. When we look at when we go into the supermarket and we say employee of the month, where is that in child protection within organizations? They can't create that. And they can't create a striving for excellence. What Jim Collins in his book Good to Great calls going from good to great. And that good is often the enemy of great because people are content with good. They don't create a culture of safety. So when we drill down and look at organizations and they talk about protection, it really starts to divide into 2 areas. One, you have protection strategies, pretty much what I have described from the CDC that grew out of that, along with a few other things. Establishing standards, you've got to have insurance coverage. You also need to have measurement of some kind. to help drive that forward. But then you also have to have elements that are the culture of protection. And these things I just mentioned, from awareness, values, skills, practice, capacity building, a passion for protection, self-motivation. How do you get each stakeholder in the organization to be motivated? Confidence that they know how to do the right thing. People are inhibited about making a mistake, making a false accusation. How do we overcome that? Peer pressure and modeling behaviors, those people that we want to be like in the organization. These are all important in shaping that culture. Peter Drucker, who is a famous writer, theoretician, lecturer in the area of organizational and business development from the 1960s into the 1970s and even the 1980s. Drucker captured this issue by saying, culture eats strategy for breakfast. And by that, he was talking about within organizations that are failing businesses that need to change in order to be more profitable, to be more successful, the people are first loyal to the culture and not the strategy. And so we have to also focus and break down what does it take to change the culture within a youth-serving organization. Okay. There are a number of things that work against us that we have to appreciate in order to get into the flow of changing the culture. One of those is that protection, as important as it is to us, to those of us that are involved in this in our life's work, it's still in competition with other priorities. There are so many priorities that are there just to keep an organization afloat so that it's solvent, it can pay its employees, it can go forward year after year after year. Another challenge is that sex abuse itself actually competes with other risks. Sex abuse within organizations tends to be a severe but infrequent occurrence compared to less severe but more frequent injuries that might happen. So when we look at all of the aspects, many of which Marcus was talking about, the different ways that we don't expect sex abuse to happen within organizations or the threats to happen, but we also have security issues within organizations, schools, religious organizations, any organizations that deal with assemblies of youth are certainly concerned about things like active shooter, bringing in weapons, fighting. You also have aggressive behaviors. You have bullying. You have challenges of potential suicide and extreme actions from bullying. And then you have physical injuries, drownings, accidental deaths. All of these are relevant to organizations and in a sense compete with the single issue of sex abuse. So it's important to keep in mind that this one problem has to fit in the context of bigger organizational issues. You also have a challenge that intervention, just as Finkelhor identified 4 preconditions for the sexual abuser, for the offender to have to work through, the person that we rely on to respond has to go through a certain thought process to be ready. They have to notice the event. They have to integrate what they're seeing, interpret what they're seeing as an urgent event that needs action. They have to choose that they're the ones to do that they are the only ones who can assume responsibility. They can't slough that off to someone else. Plenty of studies have been done over the years to show that if a bystander believes that others will do it, that they will try to allow the others to do it. Joan Tabachnik has written quite a bit on this and developed quite a bit of resources that are well worth looking into through the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Rape on the whole challenge of bystander engagement in the area of sexual abuse. And it applies to almost every area of bystander engagement. And then finally, they have to be confident that they know what to do. They don't want to make the situation worse. They don't want to falsely accuse someone any more than they want to be entangled with something that they're sorry that they got involved. All of those things have to happen before they can actually provide help. A more modern version or complication is the issue that people through social media think that they're helping just by in some way commenting on the problem. So in this cartoon, if you took the famous Kitty Genovese case from the early 1960s, and if you brought that forward today, and instead of no one looking out the window or trying to call the police, they might all think that they're doing something by making a comment on social media. There's further another challenge, and that is that's an inhibition to the average person. And that is, first of all, the average stakeholder, the average American out there, has to accept that nice people, people we admire, people we look up to, like Jimmy Savile that Marcus was talking about, that they desire to have. They may pattern their whole lives around having sex with children. Then the average person has to learn about how the abusers function, which is highly predictable, but still has to be known. Third, they have to learn the skills to intervene with confidence and with a certain accuracy that does no harm, that actually does good. And then someone has to keep track of the problem so that the person just isn't passed on. If you've been following in the news the story for Choate School in New York, and there was a quote about passing the trash and how schools, not just private schools, but public schools, will pass on a problematic person to the next school. This is typical of large organizations and networks, and all of these have to be overcome. There's another problem that has to be overcome, and that is when you talk to insurers of youth-serving organizations, schools, camps, religious organizations, they will tell you that anywhere from 90 to 95% of the problem has to do with the decision-making, the judgment, the action, or the inaction on the part of staff or volunteers that are in a position of responsibility. Well, the organization has to sort. So essentially that person has performed an at-risk behavior. And so the organization has the responsibility of trying to understand the implication of that person's action. Was it intentional or was it not intentional? Was it human error or was it a calculated risk where they were gaming the system? And can it be addressed by simply training that person better, or is the person reckless and you can't really reconcile it? Or even worse, is the person devious and very carefully setting up the system in order to support their needs and the desires? Another aspect of this is the risk pyramid. There are many, many versions of this. The origin of it came from the 1930s from H.R. Heinrich, and who wrote about it in 1931 with a classic book called The Industrial Accident Prevention, A Scientific Approach. And Heinrich generalized that for every catastrophic loss, and this was pertaining to insurable losses like an entire factory burns down, but for the principle applies to us, every catastrophic loss, there were a pattern of smaller incidents that were recorded but not really thought to be that significant. And even more than that, there was a much larger number of near misses, things that were never recorded. The dots were never connected on those things. And those altogether led up to and created the potential for severe accident to take place. One of the ways of getting at this is continually asking what if or why. A very well-known tool for this is the Six Sigma discipline. And Six Sigma uses a tool. Six Sigma, for those of you that aren't familiar, is designed for business in order to reduce business errors. And originally started with manufacturing. How do we reduce manufacturing errors so that we have a virtually error-free process? In a sense, that is what we're trying to do in youth protection. We're trying to create an error-free culture, an error-free process for serving youth. So this issue of always asking, starting, something happened. Why did that happen? And then why did that thing happen? And that, and that, and that. And the theory from Six Sigma is if you can do it 5 times, you will almost always get to the root of the problem. Another way for organizations to try to get to where they need to go is to use a tool that's very much in the Boys and Girls Club culture, and that is a from-to tool. This is something that's used a great deal in organizational leadership development, the advanced leadership program, the overall organizational development program, the development of the board presidents, the CEOs of the local organizations, is using a from-to try to define where are we now, what do we want to be like when we get there. And so in the area of youth protection, we might be wanting to go from being very short-sighted, some of the things Joan talked about, only focusing on the immediate pain, to having much more visionary approach in our policies and procedures, to going from low ability, low skills in recognizing sex abuse or many other threats, to the ability for almost everyone to see things very clearly. Going from the dissolution, yes?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I thought I heard someone asking something. I think someone hasn't muted their line. Going from from dissolution of responsibility to having more safe feedback and rewarded efforts so that people are encouraged to step in there.
Excuse me, Les, for 1 second. I'm going to
yes.
mute the lines because I'm going to get rid of that sound, and I'm going to ask you to unmute your line.
All guests have been muted. You can unmute your line by pressing *6.
Hi, Les. Press *6 to unmute your line, please,
back.
and
I'm
we
back.
got rid of that.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Please go ahead.
Okay, and then finally, avoiding corrective actions, to being able to really be able to map out corrective actions, to going back to that chart about how do we determine if an at-risk behavior was intentional or unintentional. Can it be corrected, and what's the best way to correct that? In short, can we salvage this person that we've invested in, or do we need to cut them? And do we need to move on from that? These are very important decisions. Another important thing is tracking leading indicators, finding some way to not just focus on the trailing indicators, such as we had a severe claim, we had a sex abuse claim, but looking at what do patterns of training tell us? What do patterns of screening tell us? What do minor accident reports tell us about our ability to work problems in a timely fashion? Do we have a path that we're on for policy and procedure updates to make sure that we're staying current? Do we have a pattern that we're documenting on how well we communicate different aspects of child protection? Do we have patterns that we can show in frequency of inspections and assessments? And do we conduct user satisfaction surveys to get a sense of how well people think the rank and file, the youth, the parents, other people involved that are stakeholders, what do they think we're doing with it? All of these are important to give the organization to feed into a scorecard of sorts that can tell the organization how well we're doing well in advance of a problem. So some of the planning steps that I would see, and these are things, process that Boys and Girls Clubs National went through, worked closely with its affiliate organizations. Most important thing, and this was touched on earlier, starting with a vision statement and broad goals about what's to be achieved in the area of protecting youth. Developing objectives that can be translated into measures, SMART objectives that are specific, measurable, actionable, relevant, and time-sensitive. Where applicable, bringing in outside standards to serve as a balance. Making policies as aspirational as they are directive. Developing adaptable procedures, looking at ways that people can find ways to solve a problem if they're presented with it and no other solution or the orthodox solution doesn't exist. Mapping out accountabilities. Coming up with systems that are generative, that start to suggest more ways of doing things. having feedback loops so that you know how well things are working, multiple levels of oversight that are holding each other and the organization accountable, and as I mentioned a minute ago, keeping track, keeping score. Some of the components for success: authentic support from leadership, vigorous oversight, integrating objectives, standards, and policies, having annual assessments, scorecards, setting up screening for the risk. One of the early writers about this was John Patterson in the I'm going to say screening, I'm trying to think toolkit, staff screening toolkit that John developed. And this idea of balancing the risk to the screening, in other words, stepping up the screening based on defined tiers of risk, very important for organization. Having greater ways that you communicate about this, multiple reporting paths in case people are not comfortable reporting, having a trusted way that you sort out problems, adjudicating problems internally. Many layers of security that's characteristic of any good security approach, praise and awards for people for achievement, an overall safety improvement plan, and as I mentioned earlier, this protector mindset. So with that, I will turn this back over to our hosts.
Cordelia, you'll need to press.
Now, this is Cordelia, yes, sorry. So, Les, I want to just ask you, and while I'm asking Les, if others could type in, because we're running a little over, but I want to just make sure you get a chance to respond to this and answer a few of the questions that our presenters get to answer a few of the questions that have come up. It's been fabulous information. But Les, while people are typing in their thoughts on this, I wonder if you could just answer, is there a great example of the way that you've seen an organization make a shift in culture? That might be a really long answer, but maybe something that you really saw change, or what an indicator is that a culture has really shifted?
Well, I'll give you two that are outside of Boys and Girls Clubs National because I've referred to that. One is, I think Boy Scouts has done a tremendous job with this. They have published their policies. They've been very transparent. They've addressed almost all of those issues, and they really work night and day. Michael Johnson is their national VP over child protection. And I think they've done a phenomenal job in addressing a culture and really embracing change, getting ahead of problems. And then at a local level, one of the people calling in today, Boys and Girls Clubs of Central Sonoma, California, it's a really high practitioner, has done, they've set up their own director of child safety, which is unusual for an affiliate organization to have a dedicated position for that. That one of the great things that they did in shifting their culture, they created a purple shirt team. And this team are people that have gone through a certain level of training in youth protection. And they're there to work as a team together, but they're also there as ambassadors across a very, very large local organization. Central Sonoma has about 35 or so sites just within that organization, and how you drive consistency across those. So one of the ways they've done it is through inspiration. And so they have people that serve as their commissioned within their organization as their commissioned ambassadors to drive the quality of safety. So those are two ideas that come to mind.
Okay, great. We want to start a general discussion, and there's a few questions that we've noted that are in the chat, but I want to start going back to Marcus and just saying, I'll say this year, you can pick a different year if you want, but if you were going to think back 15 years ago, what do you know now that you really wish you knew then to help organizations?
And Marcus, you might have to press *6 to unmute your phone.
Thank you. Yeah, I just caught up. So the question is, what was the knowledge that we now have that we could have done with 15 years ago?
You would have known then, yes.
I think probably, it sounds like a dreadful thing to say, but over here we've just had a wave of starting to acknowledge that we really weren't protecting children from some key people in in the way that we should have been. And I think because I think somebody said it earlier, it might have been Les, that we just don't believe that some people have the capacity to abuse. And I think it would be possibly that more of us had the courage to recognize that actually we can't label and define risk in the way we thought we should, and that it comes back for me to where that would lead us would be the emphasis on culture, not individual safeguarding. That doesn't sound very coherent. I think maybe the meaning.
No, that was quite very good, actually. I don't know, Les, if you had anything you wanted to say to that or add.
I'd say something I've learned is that a little bit of success becomes dangerous within organizations because they start to see, just as they put in place those, for example, those 6 CDC areas, and start to see some early success, and then it's very natural, they become complacent, and they begin to think this is no longer a big problem, and then people start shortcutting for convenience. This is not only true in youth protection, this is true in every kind of business that has to deal with safety and security. The initial success starts to lull people into a false sense of security.
So if people do have some questions, please, I want to suggest that they type them in. But one question that came through, maybe Marcus, start with you again. Just like someone asked, how do you document? So the indicators or the pre-indicators, maybe I think is someone, or so like that when you see someone who is sort of, I think of, sort of showing, some breaking boundaries or not quite following the code of conduct. How do you document? How do you document those indicators and make sure that those are responded to? So maybe Marcus, start with you on that one.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I will send through so that there can be a link. There's been some work that's been done that started out of the case I mentioned with the teacher who was drugging the kids so he could abuse them. And what that led to was a notion of a formal policy of people being able to notify of low-level concerns, those kinds of behaviours that don't in themselves constitute anything that's dreadfully wrong, but just starts to lead to a picture of somebody not conforming in the way that's expected, and that the whole organisation takes on the responsibility for that. And that includes a process whereby those things are recorded. And if they're genuinely low level and things that need to be addressed at a low level, then that's how they do get addressed, is the idea. So things get taken up with people in a supportive, positive way to discuss what it was that led them not to be doing things in the way that's expected and how that can be helped to be prevented. But equally, what it also enables is that if there's a pattern of those things that starts to emerge, that pattern starts to get seen, so that that can then be reviewed and evaluated to see whether it indicates potentially greater risk. So there's literally this month a paper that's just been done about that, not by academics, but by some folks who actually had a part in implementing that in some key settings, and I can certainly make sure that's available. I think it's controversial, I think it's hard to do, but I think if it can be done positively, then I think it's got huge potential.
Great, thank you. Les, do you have something you'd want to add to that?
Couple of points. Tip lines are shown to be highly effective in other areas. For example, reporting fraud. Tip lines are the most effective and the least expensive ways that fraud within corporations is detected. And so we know that people are often inhibited and they need multiple paths to be able to report something, as Marcus was talking about. And so providing a confidential line that is set up to deal with not only confirmed cases of abuse, but just complaints, suspicions. There need to be multiple ways for various stakeholders to be able to offer a complaint either confidentially or if they want, that will come back to the organization and forces the organization to follow through on that. One other thing in that same vein that I've found is that whistleblower policies, although they originally were put in place for financial whistleblowing, for ethics violations, Sarbanes-Oxley violations, whistleblower policies can be very effective in strengthening people's confidence that if they make a mistake, there will not be a retaliation against them. In other words, they falsely accuse somebody, they're erring on the side of caution.
Marcus and Les, this is so much great information. I want to do one quick question before we go into our wrap-up questions that Carolyn Shelton asked, because I think it's a great one. Any words of wisdom you have, Marcus? We'll start with you with the whole issue of it's never happened before, so we must be doing something right mentality that prevents people from taking really explicit steps to enhance their organizational practices.
Well,
any sense how you nudge that forward?
Well, certainly when I do presentations particularly for senior managers, and I use the examples from cases where there have been inquiries, because that gives so much data. So in your case, it would be, say, the free report into Sandusky. And then what I gently try and draw their attention to is that these were all really successful organizations without problems till it happened, and that if they kind of pay attention to the things I'm talking about, then they can prevent being the subject of one of the slides I do in a presentation in a couple of years' time. And it kind of changes the atmosphere in the room. And I do it as nicely as I can, but it's a way of saying nobody expects to be one of those cases till it happens. And then invariably, the inquiries look back and the same issues come time and time again. And the thing that I'd be fascinated to do, and we couldn't get anyone to agree, was after we did the research with the offenders, what we really wanted to do was do a follow-up, which was talking to organizations where they'd had serious incidents and say, what was it that at the time led you to believe you were doing everything you should be doing? And yet, actually, with hindsight, clearly you weren't. Because organizations don't intend not to, and that would be fascinating to know. But given that we don't know that, I think it is just trying to highlight for people that actually just because it hasn't happened doesn't make you safe, it just makes you lucky.
That's great, and I wonder just for time, Joan, if we don't need to go to our takeaway and perhaps start that with Les, but we need to get to our next slide there.
Sure. So usually what we usually like to ask, and maybe my quick 2 cents on that question as well, is that I know in our synagogue I had a hard time getting people to acknowledge that this is a possibility, and we started talking about, given the size of our congregation, it's not a matter of if, but a matter of when. And that seemed to help people think about then how to prepare. So that was just one other quick way of thinking about it. But what we like to do is sort of in our takeaway, sort of ask, maybe start with Les, and just of the things that you listened to and heard from Marcus today. What's sort of the one maybe takeaway that you would say that what you learned from the work that Marcus presented today?
I would say
Marcus will ask the same thing of you in a second, so just prepare.
I gathered, yeah.
I would say that the slippery slope model was a very effective model, and the idea that if the organization doesn't do something at an early stage, it's very, very hard to extract itself and address the problem or extract itself from the problem at a later stage, because the tendency of any organization is to procrastinate, and it's just the nature of organizations until they're forced to act. So I'd say one of the takeaways is it was a good reinforcement on the need to act earlier instead of later on this.
Great, thank you. And Marcus?
I think it's probably, what am I going to steal? And I think it is that I'm always aware that I can sort of do the big picture, these are the big ideas, but when it comes down to people saying, are there tools I can use or ways that I can actually use to review how my organization functions and what's happening, then I come up rather lighter on that. And I thought some of Les's tools for doing that, the worksheet and those kind of models, was was really helpful and will be really helpful to organizations that want to take some action. So they may, in an appropriately attributed and modified form, start appearing in presentations by me over here in the future.
Great. And we're also wanting people to please, we want to know what you're taking away, so type that in and or go to the next one. The next slide that we're going to ask our presenters to address is, what's one action you're really hoping that people take away from today? And as all of you that are on, please, what's an action something you're taking away or an action you want to take? Because we want people to actually go away from listening to this and do something. So Les, what's one action you'd like to see people take as a result of today, or you plan to take?
Okay. I would say I would like you to see for child sex abuse prevention as a problem that could solve other problems. The issue that if you put prevention in place, it does more than solve that problem for the organization. It does more to protect the organization, which is a totally valid approach, but it also begins to shape people's ability to see and intervene on behalf of youth to solve a whole range of problems that may not even be connected to child sexual abuse, but it's very beneficial to the organization. I think that's necessary in order to sell a program to an organization.
Great. And Marcus, what's one takeaway action you either plan on doing, or one action you plan on doing or you hope people do? And
Sure. First thing I say is I absolutely endorse what Les was just saying, that if all those things are just done in order to be a better safeguarding organization, then that's commendable. But I think the real virtue of that focus, for me, that focus on a positive organizational culture, it has the benefit of being safeguarding, but equally it makes for a better place to work. So it's like it's not just about safeguarding. But my specific one action I would suggest to folks is maybe consider as an organization, what's the balance that the organization puts on the Stockade approach, on the screening and vetting, and what emphasis on culture, and is that balance, is it in balance? Does it actually, is the proportion right? And if it's not, then thinking about how to move it towards the more appropriate proportions of each.
That's great. Thank you. We are right near the end of our time here, Joan, so I'll see if I can get us to the next slide. Yep. So quickly that Gatekeepers for Kids has a really actually wonderful resource library. So if you just Google Gatekeepers for Kids and Enough Abuse campaign, they'll have great examples of policies and things you may want to take a look at. So for those who want additional training, it's a great place to go. Also to say that if you want to contact any of us, if you go to the next slide, Cordelia, there's our contact information. So please feel free to reach out to any of us if there's some other questions or additional resources that you might need. Back to you, Cordelia. And then we just want to again say we've got another one. You see, of course, Prevent Connect has all kinds of webinars coming up, but we have another one in this particular series on July 25th. A new look at addressing children with problematic sexual behaviors. Mostly we just want to say it is time and thank you. And I've got to tell you, you guys covered so much information in your time. It was really wonderful. Marcus and Les, thank you so much.
Pleasure.
All the participants. It was really an amazing amount of information. My notes look like, I don't know what, great art here. It's rendered so much in these places. So thank you. And David, I know you'll be putting up an evaluation and that this is recorded. So is there anything you want to say in closing?
Just want to thank everyone for joining us today for today's Prevent Connect Power and Prevention Ending Child Sexual Abuse web conference. Encourage you to join us on July 25th. We'll send out the announcement in early July. We'll get everyone added to our list. And thank you so much to Les, Marcus, Joan, and Cordelia, Megna for all the work behind the scenes. And we look forward to seeing you online in the future. I'll keep the text chat open for a minute, but this concludes our audio portion of today's web conference.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.